He'd seen too many men die in the mud of Virginia to believe anything was watching over the world but the sun and the crows. He lived where the Nevada desert met the foothills of Sierras, a place where the wind sounded like a woman crying if you listened too long. He had a small ranch, 3 horses that didn't care for conversation, and a past he'd buried deeper than the well in his yard. If you are still here with me listening to this folk story, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and ride along with us. Now let's continue. It was a Tuesday when the world decided to remind him that some things stay buried, and some things come crawling out of the dark looking for a light. The sun was dropping, turning the sky the color of a fresh bruise. Silas was finishing his rounds, the smell of dry sage and horse sweat clinging to his coat. That's when he saw it, a flash of white against the gray sand near the trough. At first, he thought it was a calf that had wandered too far. Then he saw the hair, long, matted, and dark as a starless night. He didn't run. Men like Silas didn't run toward trouble. They walked toward it with one hand near the holster. She was curled into a ball, her dress, if you could call it that, nothing more than rags held together by grit and hope. Her feet were bare and bleeding. Her breathing was a ragged, wet sound that made his own chest ache. Silas knelt in the dirt, the dust puffing up around his knees. "Easy now," he murmured. His voice was like gravel under a boot. He hadn't used it for anything but commands in 3 days. She stirred, her eyes opened, and for a second, Silas saw the kind of terror that usually only comes right before the hammer until they bled. She didn't try to get up. She just shrank back, trying to disappear into dry earth. "Please," she whispered. The word was so thin, it almost blew away in the wind. "It's my first night, be gentle." Silas froze. His stomach did a slow, sick roll. He knew that look. He'd seen it in the eyes of the livestock at the auctions in Reno. He'd seen it in the eyes of people who had been told they were nothing but a price tag on a ledger. "I ain't gonna hurt you, girl," Silas said. He reached out, his hand calloused and scarred from years of breaking stone and horses. He went to touch her shoulder, to offer some kind of human comfort. But as his fingers brushed the tattered sleeve of her dress, he felt it. It wasn't skin. It wasn't cloth. It was cold. It was heavy. Silas pulled back the rag of her sleeve, and the breath died in his throat. Wrapped around her wrist was a band of iron, 2 inches wide and thick enough to hold a bull. It was bolted shut, the metal biting into her skin until the flesh was raw and weeping. He didn't need to see the other wrist to know. He didn't need to ask where she'd come from. That iron was the mark of the Black Canyon mines, a place men went to disappear and women went to die. Silas looked at the iron. He looked at the girl. Then he looked out at the horizon, where the dust of the trail was already starting to settle. "The storm is coming," he whispered to the empty air. And for the first time in 12 years, Silas Thorne felt his heart start to beat again. The cabin was small, but it was sturdy. Silas carried her inside like she was made of blown glass. She didn't weigh much more than a handful of winter wheat. He laid her on the cot near the stove and set to work. He didn't ask her name. Names were dangerous things in this part of the country. Instead, he built a fire. He didn't do it because the night was cold. He did it because the light of a fire is the only thing that can chase away the shadows of a cage. He boiled water. He tore up a clean shirt, the one he saved for Sundays, and began to wash the road from her skin. He was careful. He moved slowly. Every time his hand got near that iron shackle, she flinched, her whole body trembling like a leaf in a gale. "I can't get it off." "Not yet," Silas said, nodding toward the iron. "I need a file, maybe a smith, but I can make it stop biting." He wrapped the raw skin in lard and clean cloth, tucking it under the metal so it wouldn't rub. She watched him the whole time. She didn't speak. She just tracked his movements like a trapped animal watching a hunter. He made coffee, bitter black, and strong enough to wake the dead. He handed her a tin cup, his fingers brushing hers. She took a sip, her eyes never leaving his face. "Why?" she finally asked. Her voice was getting stronger, but it was still full of holes. Silas sat at the wooden table, his silhouette large against the firelight. He looked at his hands. "Because I knew a man once who walked away when he should have stood still. I spend every night since then trying to find him. Maybe I just found him today." They sat in silence for a long time. The only sound was the crackle of the pine knots in the stove and the wind rattling the shutters. Silas knew what was out there. He knew that a girl with iron on her wrists didn't just walk away from Black Canyon. Someone would be coming. Someone who thought they owned the air she breathed and the ground she stood on. Silas stood up and walked to the corner of the room. He reached behind a stack of old crates and pulled out a long, heavy shape wrapped in oilcloth. He unwrapped it slowly. The metal of the Winchester gleamed in the firelight like an old friend. He started to clean it. He didn't need to. It was already spotless. But the rhythm of it calmed him. The click of the lever, the smell of the oil, the weight of the lead. If you're still here listening to this, I'd say you're a lot like Silas. You know that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are stacked against you. You want to see if the iron finally breaks or if the shadows win. And believe me, you want to be here for what happens next. So, if you haven't already, now's the time to hit that subscribe button. Because out here in the West, the real fight doesn't start until the sun goes down. The next morning, the desert was cold and cruel. Silas was out on the porch, whittling a piece of cedar into nothing, his eyes fixed on the ridge road. He heard the door creak. She stepped out, wearing one of those old shirts that hung down to her knees. She looked better, but the fear was still there, tucked behind her eyes like a secret. She sat on the top step, her shackled wrists resting in her lap. "They call me Alara," she said. Silas didn't look up from his wood. "Silas." "He's coming, Silas. Julian Vane. He doesn't lose things. He says everything in the canyon belongs to him. I've heard of Vane," Silas said. "Heard he's a man who likes to play God, because he's too rich to be a man." Alara let out a dry, hollow laugh. "He isn't a god. He's a ghost. He makes you feel like you aren't there anymore, like you're just a part of the machine." She looked at the iron. "I ran because I wanted to remember what my own heart sounded like." "You remember now?" Silas asked. She looked at him, and for a second, the terror vanished. It sounded like a drum, like it's waiting for something to happen. Silas nodded. He knew that drum. He'd heard it at Shiloh. He'd heard it every day since he'd come to this desert. The day passed in a strange, heavy peace. Alara helped where she could. She couldn't do much with the shackles, but she sat in the shade and peeled the few potatoes he had. Silas mended the fence. He checked the horses. He cleaned the Winchester again. He didn't cut wood. He didn't prepare the garden. He just waited. Late in the afternoon, the air got still. The birds stopped singing. The horses in the corral started to pace, their ears twitching toward the south. Silas stood up and walked to the edge of the porch. He squinted against the glare. There on the horizon was a thin ribbon of dust. It wasn't a wagon. It was moving too fast for that. Riders. 3 of them. "Inside," Silas said. Alara didn't argue. She stood up, her face turning the color of ash. She retreated into the cabin, but she didn't hide in the corner. She stood by the window, her hand gripping the sill so hard her knuckles turned white. Silas didn't go inside. He sat back down in his chair. He leaned the Winchester against his leg. He picked up his whittling knife and a fresh piece of wood. He looked like a man who didn't have a care in the world, but his eyes were like flint. The riders came up the lane slowly. They knew they had the advantage. They were wearing fine clothes, velvet vests, and silk ties, but they carried their guns like men who use them for sport. The man in the middle was younger than the others, with hair the color of corn silk and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Julian Vane. He reined on his horse 10 feet from the porch. The dust swirled around him, coating his expensive boots. He looked at Silas, then at the cabin, then back at Silas. "Afternoon, old-timer," Vane said. His voice was smooth, like honey poured over a blade. Silas didn't look up. "The sun's still up?" "I reckon it is." "I'm looking for something that belongs to me," Vane said. "A piece of property that wandered off. Little thing. Dark hair. Carrying some of my iron." Silas carved a long, thin sliver of wood. "Don't see much property around here. Just wind and dirt. You're welcome to the dirt, but the wind's a bit hard to catch." Vane's smile flickered. The two men behind him shifted in their saddles, their hands moving closer to their holsters. "Let's not do this," Vane said. "I've got a long ride back, and I've already lost enough time. Just bring her out. I'll even give you a few coins for the trouble of feeding her." Silas finally looked up. He didn't look at the guns. He looked straight into Vane's eyes. "I don't take coins for doing what's right, and I don't give back what the desert's already claimed as free." Vane sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment. "I was hoping you'd be smarter. You look like a man who's seen enough war to know when he's beat." "I've seen enough war to know that the man who thinks he's already won is the one who bleeds the fastest," Silas said. Vane's face went cold. He didn't draw. He just nodded to the man on his left. The rider moved fast, his hand blurring toward his hip. But Silas was faster. He didn't reach for the Winchester. He threw the whittling knife. The blade caught the rider in the meat of his forearm. He let out a yelp, his pistol clattering to the dirt before he could even thumb the hammer. The second rider went for his rifle, but Silas had the Winchester up and level before the man could clear his scabbard. "Nobody needs to die today," Silas said. His voice was steady. The barrel of the rifle didn't move an inch. "But if that hand moves again, I'm putting a hole in that horse's saddle, and I won't much care if you're sitting in it." Vane looked at his wounded man, then at Silas. The smile was gone now. In its place was something ugly and raw. "You think you can keep her?" Vane hissed. "I have 100 men." Vane stared him down for a long heartbeat. Then he jerked his horse around. "Enjoy your night, Silas Thorne. It's the last one you're ever going to have." They rode off, the dust swallowing them up. Silas didn't move until they were over the ridge. Then he let out a breath he'd been holding since Tuesday. He felt a hand on his shoulder. Ilera was standing behind him, her eyes wide. "He'll be back," she said. "I know," Silas replied. He looked at the Winchester. "Go get the coffee. We've got a long night ahead of us." The moon was a sliver of silver against the black velvet of the sky. Silas had moved the horses to the far pasture and doused the lamps in the cabin. He sat on the porch in the shadows, the Winchester across his lap. Ilera sat inside near the stove. She was holding a heavy iron file he'd given her. She was working on the Shackle, the scritch of metal on metal providing a heartbeat for the house. "Tell me about the girl you didn't save," Ilera said from the darkness. Silas flinched. He hadn't told her that. He hadn't told anyone. "How do you know?" "Because you look at me like you're trying to fix a ghost," she said. Silas stared out into the desert. Her name was Sarah, my sister, back in '62. I went off to where the blue and left her at the farm. I thought the war was something that happened on battlefields. I didn't know it happened in kitchens and barns. He paused, his jaw tightening. When I got back, the farm was ash, and Sarah, she'd been gone for a year. I never found where they took her. I just found the silence she left behind. "You're saving her now," Ilera whispered. "I'm just holding a gun. Ilera, the saving's up to you." Scritch, scritch, scritch. Hours passed. The desert was never truly quiet. There was a scuttle of lizards, the hoot of an owl, the long, lonely howl of a coyote. But then Silas heard something else. The sound of boots on gravel. Not horses. They were coming on foot. He stood up, moving like a shadow. He slipped off the porch and into the tall grass near the side of the house. He didn't breathe. He didn't blink. He saw them, for shapes moving in a line. They were carrying torches, but they hadn't lit them yet. They wanted to get close. They wanted to see the look on his face when the fire started. Silas waited until they were 20 feet from the door. "That's far enough," he barked. The shadows exploded into motion. A flash of gunfire lit up the night. Silas dove behind a rain barrel. There was splintering above his head. He returned fire. The Winchesters roared deafening in the small clearing. One of the shadows went down with a scream. The others scrambled for cover behind the fence line. "Vane!" Silas yelled. "I know you're back there. Come and do your own killing." A laugh drifted through the dark. "Why should I? I pay for the work." "Silas, it's the American way." A bottle arched through the air, a rag dipped in kerosene burning at its neck. It hit the roof of the cabin and shattered. A bloom of orange fire climbed the shingles. Ilera, out! Now! Silas screamed. The door burst open. Ilera ran out, her hands still held together by the iron, but she wasn't looking for cover. She was looking for him. Silas! He ran for her, bullets kicking up the dirt at his heels. He grabbed her and swung her behind the stone well house just as another bottle of fire hit the porch. The cabin was going up. The drywood was hungry, and the flames were eating it whole. The light of the fire turned the yard into high noon. There was nowhere to hide. Give her up, Silas. Vane yelled. He was standing near the gate now, a pistol in each hand, looking like a demon in the firelight. Look at your house. It's gone. You have nothing left. Silas looked at the cabin. Everything he owned was in there. His memories, his peace, his silence. He watched the roof cave in, a fountain of spark. You're right, Vane. Silas yelled back. He stood up, stepping out from behind the well. He didn't raise his rifle. He just stood there. I have nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous thing God ever made. Vane laughed and raised his gun. Goodbye, old-timer. But Silas wasn't looking at Vane. He was looking at the ridge behind him. A thunderous sound broke over the hills. Not one gun. 20. A volley of lead tore into ground around Vane's men. From the darkness, a voice roared, "Sheriff's office. Drop him or join the dirt." Vane froze. His men scrambled, realized they were caught between a burning house and a wall of law, and threw their guns down. Vane turned, his face twisted in shock, as a dozen riders descended on the ranch. In the lead was Abram Hale, the man with the badge from the old stories. He looked at Silas, then at the burning cabin, then at Vane. Silas. Abram said, tipping his hat, "Got your note. Smelled like gunpowder and regret, just like you said it would." Silas didn't smile. He just walked over to where Vane was being shoved onto his knees by two deputies. Silas looked down at the man who thought he owned the world. "The desert doesn't belong to you, Vane," Silas said quietly. "It doesn't belong to anyone. It just lets us stay for a while. And your stay just ended." The sun was coming up, a pale yellow light bleeding over the mountains. The cabin was a smoking ruin, nothing but the stone chimney left standing like a tombstone. Abram and his men were leading Vane and the others away in chains. Real chains, the kind the law uses. Silas and Ilera sat on the back of a wagon. Silas had a heavy hammer and a chisel he'd pulled from the remains of his tool shed. "Steady," he said. He placed the chisel against the bolt of the shackle. He struck it once. Hard. The sound rang out across the quiet desert. The bolt sheared off, and the iron fell to the wooden floor of the wagon with a heavy thud. Ilera rubbed her wrist. The skin was scarred, a permanent reminder of the canyon. But she was breathing, really breathing. "What will you do?" she asked. Silas looked at the ruins of his home. "Start over. I've done it before. Maybe this time I'll build the porch a little wider. Room for 2 chairs. Ilera looked at him, and for the first time, she smiled. It was a small thing, but it was real. "I'd like that," she said. "If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you that even when everything burns, something new can grow from the ashes, then go ahead and hit that like button. Leave a comment, and tell me what time it is where you are. Tell me if you've ever had to break your own shackles. And if you want to hear more stories of the men and women who built the West with blood and hope, hit that subscribe button and ride along with us. Because out here, the stories don't end when the fire goes out. They just wait for the next sunrise. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you on the next trail."